Good morning, welcome back to I Studio, and I'm continuing with the floater frames, drop-in frames, and how I'm going to complete this project is the panels have all been sanded, sides, back, painted out in the sides. Now what I need to do is I need to put a barrier coat before the varnish. I had a very glossy barrier coat, but I've done some surface sanding to smooth out some rough spots, and I want to even it out with my polymer mediums. The second thing we're going to do today is we're going to wax the frames and buff them. After that, the next steps will be varnishing the panels and then waxing the panels and attaching the panels to the frames. So it's a process that takes a while. Let's get started with putting the mediums on the panels. The first thing that I want you to do is make sure that your panels are cleaned. We've done some sanding. We've got some dust that got on the surfaces. I have a clean cloth. I just wiped them. They're good to go now. The next thing I want to show you is mixing up the polymer medium. I have a clean mixing bowl and a clean brush. I want a satin finish. So in order to achieve that, I'm going to mix polymer medium gloss and polymer medium matte. Let's start with the matte. I'm just estimating how much medium I'll need for 3. And I think that's way too much, but that's okay. I have a jar that I pour the excess in, and then I already have pre-mixed medium. Okay, so we have the matte. I'm going to do not quite as much gloss. There we go. Probably about 30% of the gloss. Now remember, this is not going to be the final coat. We still have a varnish and a cold wax. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to mix this with about 25% water. The reason that I add the water is I don't want brush strokes. I want to thin it down. And I usually use about 25% water. So we've got our polymer medium gloss, our polymer medium matte, and the water. And the way I'm mixing it is with the brush, very gently. What I don't want is to whip up bubbles in my medium. This will show on the surface of the paintings as little dots. So gently mix it with your brush. Okay, now, when I put it on, I'm just floating it on the surface. Not too thick, not too thin. It doesn't matter what direction I go, because hopefully I've thinned it down enough that I'm not going to get brush strokes. And I am getting a very even application, which looks great so far. You want to let this dry for 72 hours before you do the varnish. And the reason is, if there is moisture underneath the varnish, it's going to make the surface look cloudy. Okay, and then I quickly check my sides, just wipe off any drips. We're good to go. Repeat that on all 3 surfaces. If the surface turns out too matte, because I did use a little more matte than gloss, I have 2 choices. I can put another barrier coat on with more gloss, or I can wait until I varnish, and I can adjust my varnish the same way I adjusted the polymer mediums by blending the matte with the gloss. And if I want it a little more matte, I put in a little more matte. A little more gloss will make it a little shinier. So these are all choices you make. And I think each painting calls for the surface that it wants. Some want to be shiny, some want to be matte. We're having a pretty warm day in California, so this won't take long to dry. But like I said, I want it to cure for 72 hours before we go into the varnish. You notice the long brush strokes I refer to as floating that surface on. Don't get real nitpicky with your surface. And by that I mean don't do your little short scrubby marks. Don't want any of that. Okay. So we'll let these dry and we'll go on to waxing the frames. Okay, now for the waxing of the floater frame. You've seen a lot of demonstrations that I've done on YouTube about waxing the surfaces of our paintings. This is the same, except we're doing the floater frame. I'm using the Gamblin cold wax, and I keep a little waxing rag inside the can. I don't want to get too much wax on the frame. It'll be very hard to buff it out. So I'm just rubbing this in to the surface of the frame, to the top of the frame. Those little ridges inside, I should probably get a little in there too. That's going to be the hard part to buff out. Get a little globs in there, and I don't want that. So what we're going to do is we're going to wax the surfaces of this, and then we have to let that wax dry for, it depends on the conditions in the room. I've got the heaters on today, and it is a pretty sunny day, so I would say 20 to 40 minutes until this is dry enough to buff. And I usually hand buff first, and then I'll use a sanding attachment to buff. And for that, I'll be able to buff the outer edge and the top only. That attachment won't get into those little ridges, but I think we can do well enough by hand to get those ridges done. This is a learning experience for me too. I completed these little paintings about 3 years ago. probably ordered the floater frames about that same time, and I just put off the inevitable, putting them together. I encourage everyone to bring your paintings to a completed state. And the reason that I strongly suggest that is many, many times you will be asked to step in for a show that someone couldn't do. Someone couldn't make the show for some reason. And if you have a reputation for being ready on the fly, then people will call on you. Gallerists will call on you. Hey, I've got a space next month, next week, tomorrow. Can you bring over 9, 10, 11, 12 paintings? Well, I can do that because my paintings hopefully are wired, signed, sides painted out, surfaces done. I try to do that as I complete the paintings. The reason that that doesn't often happen, or always happen, I should say, is sometimes I'm not sure if a painting's done. If I'm not sure if it's done, I'll set it aside for a little while I'm deciding what to do. And sometimes those stack up. That's the case with these 3 little panels. I just wasn't sure that I liked them. And I brought them out the other day in a workshop for a demonstration. And I just loved them. Sometimes it takes you a couple of years to really understand what it is you've done. The paintings are always way ahead of what we see, what we know. So it's a very good idea to trust the paintings. It can work the opposite. You can go back 6 months, a year, 3 years, and say, oh my God, what was I thinking? This is horrible. And then you've got a surface that you can rework. And I've been reworking a lot of paintings. Mine go back, way into the 90s. And sometimes I'm just not that crazy about what I see when I pull them out. My stretcher bars were good, and I can paint into them or I can paint over them. You can either gesso it out and start with a clean slate, but more often than not, I'll paint into them because some of the painting that I've already done can make beautiful underpaintings. So I'll get back to you when the wax on all 3 of these frames is dry, and I'll show you a little bit about buffing. These frames dried very fast. The cold wax is drying quickly today. I think the conditions are great in the studio. And I'll put this towel down. My surface is not that clean. So I'm going to protect the frames with the towel. That way I won't pick up any paint or mediums on them. So just like waxing a car, you're just taking the wax off. Wax on, wax off. Like the Karate Kid, Mr. Miyagi. I hope you've been watching Cobra Kai. It's kind of fun. These honestly probably don't need the electric sander, but I'm going to demonstrate that to you anyway. This wood was very, very thirsty. I may decide to put 2 coats on. We'll see. But, I can put another coat on after the paintings are in the frame. I could just go over. I would just probably do the back and the top at that point. The edge here. and the top edge here. But this is pretty. For an inexpensive floater frame, it sure looks great. The thing that you do when you do it yourself like this is you're taking an awful lot of time. So you kind of have to weigh, should I do it myself and save a lot of money? Or should I pay the pros to do it and spend my time doing painting? 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. Okay. This looks great. I'm very pleased. Remember, I had sanded this wood with the 220, the very fine sandpaper. So we had a great surface to work on. I'm just trying to get all the wax out of these little ridges. Buffing is very, very easy on these frames. Okay, so I've given it a hand rub. I love it. Looks very good. And the way you can tell if you've buffed it enough is your rag slides effortlessly. If there's a spot that you didn't get, it'll kind of catch. But this is great. I don't think I've probably gotten the inside as well as I need, especially in the corners. I have some little wax that wants to bunch up. I could get like a pencil or some thing and cover it with the cloth and really, really dig into the corners if I have a problem. In this case, not too much of a problem that I can't dig it out with my finger. So I'm just making sure that we have a good surface to buff. Okay, so buffing. I usually just use my hand sander. I don't use the evac sander for this. This is the sandpaper. You don't want to buff it with sandpaper. Take that paper off. And this is a buffing pad. It's like a sponge. Put that on the buffer. And then what I do, I actually will put a paper towel or a thin rag between the buffer and the wood. And why I do that is it preserves my buffing pad. They're kind of hard to come by. So beautiful. So that's the frame, the finished frame. Buffed, sanded, waxed, buffed, and ready to go. You notice I didn't put any varnish or anything on the frame. I just simply put the cold wax, and I think that's sufficient. I think it looks great. Okay. The panels are drying beautifully. I like the surface. I don't know if you can see. There's little moisture on it, but trying to see if I kind of catch the light for you. We've lost that really glossy surface, which I thought wasn't really appropriate for these. I think they're looking great. Ready to go. Let's dry fit it and see what we're going to have. It's going to be nice. I'll show you varnishing, waxing, and then attaching them to the frames later on. Hi, Chuck.
Hi.
Chuck has agreed to put the brackets on the drop-in frames and the pictures for me. So let's see how that's done.
Right. Well, there's the back of the panel is here. And we have to attach these brackets like so, so they will hold the piece in place. So we got two challenges. One, we don't want these brackets to go too far up and push it away from the frame. And so I've got this piece of styrofoam here that will hold the frame securely against this.
So that pushes the picture up into the frame.
Right. So what I'll do first is I'll set these inside the frame. And then what I'm going to have to do, the next challenge will be to line these things up and center them. And the best way I've done that in the past is I use little shims and flip them over, and then I can set the last screws. So always a little bit of a challenge, but it's doable. So I try to approximate them, and they don't have to be, you don't have to really measure here. They don't have to be perfect. They can go in pretty easily.
So you're just attaching it to the frame at this point and not the
Right.
panel.
But I want it to be at the right height. So let's see, now it's at the right height.
So I guess another concern that I have is I certainly wouldn't want the screw to go through the panel.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Did you check the depth of that?
Yes. So this panel here will be about like this when it's done. It'll be up a little bit more because of the thickness of the bracket.
So that looks like it's getting pretty close.
It is pretty close, but you still got a good,
Here, move your finger. Let's take a look.
3/16
Where are you?
of an inch there. So
Can't
you're
see
pretty
it.
good.
Can't see it. Your finger's in the way.
It's in the way. I can't hold it. It's too small. So you got a ways. But you're right. I already had checked that, and we're good there. So that's the good news. This is one of these projects that you have to take time. Now you could get really crazy and measure and get them right in the middle, but it doesn't matter because it's in the back of the frame, and you can just be approximate.
So remember, he's not attaching it to the panel yet. He's just putting the brackets into the floater frame.
Yeah, making sure that the proper depth of the frame will be, when you set it back, it'll be flush and it's all the way up against the surface is what we want here. Okay. So far so good.
Now show them again how you got the panel to push up into the frame.
A book or this piece of styrofoam.
Yes, something that's going to push the panel up to be flush with the back of the frame.
Mm-hmm. Good. Are we okay?
Ready.
Okay. So that part's done. So we now know when we flip it over, it'll sit flush where it's supposed to. Our next challenge is to make sure the border around this is even or looks even. And I'm going to have to get some sort of shims here. I haven't gotten that far yet. You can use tile spacers, the plastic tile spacers. I'm going to go see if I have some. Or you can use just some cardboard and wedge it in there.
Mm-hmm.
And then once you wedge it in there, it'll hold you again. You'll flip it over, and then you can set the other screws.
Okay, so what's going on now?
Well, I'm just making some cardboard spacers because I couldn't find my tile ones. So good old cardboard, and I'm just folding it and approximating, the thickness I need. It's not too hard to do. And you just kind of mess with it until you get what you need and get it spaced the way you want it. And by doing that, see, I've kind of evened it out here, you know.
I think this is the trickiest part of the whole business, right?
Yeah, yep, it certainly is. And sometimes you have to make some adjustments.
And I think these frames are particularly hard because they have that little secondary ridge. Does that make it harder?
Yeah, it definitely does. You
Let's,
have to do this with every type. So what I'll do now that I've got this pretty even, looks good all the way around, is I'll just flip it back over on its front. It should hold still. Now I can just do a set screw, and it should be pretty good. And I've got a trick here too, is once you set the screws, should probably get a book. Excuse me. I'll be back. I retrieved a more appropriate book.
And why are you getting the book? Because the foam was flexing?
It's giving, yeah. And when I pushed down, it worked fine on the sides, but...
Is that going to be thick enough?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So did you get the one set screw in?
Yes, I got the top
Okay,
one.
then did you turn it over and look?
Yeah, you can do that, but, make sure it hasn't moved. But it looks pretty good still.
Okay.
Make any adjustments. Let's make sure it's tight. I think, because once I get this screw in, it'll be fixed. It won't move. So, the first two screws are tricky. But after that, this is the kind of thing you want to take your time with, Because if you take your time, usually it pays off. Let's kind of keep these in a certain order. So when I do the next one, they'll all be the same. Like that. Voila. I don't know which the top is, but anyway, you can see it's pretty even all the way around.
Both sides?
Yeah. Pretty close.
Great.
Yeah.
Hi, we've got our three little babies in the frame. They're looking really good. And we have 3 more steps to complete the process. One is we're going to put down the polymer medium protective coat, the barrier coat. We're going to let that dry for 72 hours, and then we're going to go into the varnish coat. And the way they're done is almost identical. I'm going to show you how we put the polymer medium, the barrier coat, on using a gloss and a matte polymer medium blended together to give me a satin finish. We're going to let that dry, and then we'll go into the varnish coat. And we're going to do the same thing with the varnish. We're going to blend the matte and the gloss varnish. A little more matte, probably 75% matte, 25% gloss. The difference is with varnish, with this Liquitex varnish, I should say, you do not add water. Please do not add water. But other than that, the way we're going to blend it, the way we're going to brush it on is going to be identical. Third and final is the wax coat. Okay, I'm not going to make you wait 72 hours between each of the layers before I wax these and wrap it up. I'm going to put the protective barrier coat on with the polymer medium, tell you it's the same thing we're going to do with the varnish. And then I'm going to show you how I'm going to wax a painting that has already been cured. So you'll have the whole finishing process down, and then we're ready to send them out into the world, hopefully. So let's go. Okay, for this, you're going to use the gloss medium. This is called gloss medium. Brilliant. This is called matte medium. Matte. These are polymer mediums. Sometimes they're called by different names, but this is what Golden calls them. I want a satin finish, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use primarily my matte medium. And we don't have a huge surface amount to do on these 3 little pieces, so I probably put too much in the bowl with the matte. I'm just going to put in about 25% gloss. I don't need the whole thing gloss. I want it more satiny. There we go. I don't use measuring cups. I just use my eyes. The last thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to thin this down with water. And I always say about 25% water, so about the same proportion I put in of gloss medium, I'll just put in of the water. It's very important that you do not shake it or whip it to stir it up. I take my brush and I very, very gently blend it in a very clean container. This is a little enamel plate that I use for so many things, primarily my palette and for glossing and varnishing, or I should say for the barrier coat and the varnish. So you can see it's quite a thin consistency. Let's see. And this is ready to go. There are no bubbles that I've whipped up inside of it. It's looking good. Okay, here they are on the table. I've named them Winter Bridge 1, 2, and 3. They're wired, they're signed, ready to go. I've wired it with D-ring and picture hanging wire. I do have videos, my YouTube videos to show you how. Now, I would have liked to do this barrier coat and the varnish and the waxing before they were put into the frame, but I had the opportunity to have my husband frame them for me, and I knew I could go back and do the barrier coat and the varnish and the waxing afterwards, so I had to take advantage of his help. So I want to be careful that I don't slop a lot of extra medium off the edge. So you want to float it on, but in this case I'm not going to get too sloppy. And although this will dry quickly, within a couple of hours, it's not cured for about 72 hours. So don't be impatient. I've demonstrated this before, and I've told you that what will happen if you are too quick to put the varnish on, you could have moisture trapped inside, which will make the painting cloudy when you add the varnish. So that's why you want it to dry really, really well. It goes on a little gloss. It will dry to more of a satin because of the way I've mixed it. It's amazing how time-consuming this finishing part of the project is. And I've said it before and I'll say it again. I probably spend 30% of my time on the finishing process. %30 on preparing my surfaces, and the rest on painting. So it's roughly a third, and a third, and that can vary. Nothing is set in stone. Because I've thinned the barrier coat, it does not matter which way I put it on. The brush strokes will level out. One of the reasons I particularly recommend varnishing with collage is that a lot of collage material will fade in the sun. And the varnish is going to give us a UV protectant. Also, because I've used both Sumi ink and Stabilo pencil on these, those are what they call fugitive materials. And fugitive materials will change over time. They're not stable. Okay, there we go. So now we play the waiting game for another 72 hours. And after that, we will varnish. And please remember, do not add water to the varnish. Only to the polymer medium, only to the barrier coat, not to the final varnish coat. Okay, I'm going to quickly go over the waxing process with you. I've done this on a couple of other videos that you might want to check out. And it's very simple. I use Gamblin cold wax. Keep a little rag in the can. And it's just like waxing a car. You put a little wax on the rag and in circular motions, wax on. I want to be sure and get the sides as well, since I am going to wax and polish the sides. You put the wax on. You let it dry into a glaze, just like you do with your car. You don't want to get too much wax on. If you do, it's really hard to get it off. This is a physical job. Okay. Up with sides. Smear a little wax on the edges. So I've got enough residual wax on the rag. I'm not even dipping it in the can. That's it. Let that dry, and we're going to come back and polish it, and then we'll be done. Remember, I'm just using this to illustrate how we wax. We're not quite ready to wax our little triptych series yet. 72 hours, the barrier coat's going to dry. I'm going to varnish it, let that dry 72 hours. And then the wax. So it is a process. Okay. Hi, I'm back. It's been about 20 minutes. It's dried pretty quickly. Now, all I'm going to do is I'm going to rub it with soft cotton cloths. And just like waxing the car, circular motions, wax off. It immediately starts to buff into a beautiful surface sheen. It is not too gloss, not too matte. Has a real natural quality. Unlike the varnishes and polymer mediums that we've used that have kind of a plasticky surface. This is much more natural. Absolutely gorgeous. Takes a little elbow grease for this part. I'm glad it's a fairly small piece. I've done this with big old monsters. When it's buffed, your cloth will glide. Before it's buffed, it kind of grabs the cloth. So even if I were blindfolded doing this process, I would know where I've buffed, where I haven't. And don't be afraid to use several cloths. See, it's grabbing my cloth here. I know. Haven't gotten this part buffed yet. Some parts where you got a little thick applying the wax, it's even harder to buff it off. Can feel it sticking down here, so I know I've neglected this corner. Okay, I'll give it the all over test. to get the edges. I'll hang the edges over the table. Now that I have it all hand rubbed, I'm going to buff it with my sander. Take the sandpaper off. Put my buffing pad on. Looks like I picked up a little paint on my hand somewhere from the table, so I want to be sure I get a clean shop towel. Put the shop towel down and buff it by putting the sander on the shop towel. That preserves the buffing pad. So that's it. You've learned all about drop-in frames, finishing your piece, and I hope you've learned something. I hope you've enjoyed it. Remember, art is a practice, and practice makes perfect. Go to your studio and practice. While you're doing that, have a little fun. It's good for the soul, I promise you that. Okay? See you next time. Ready to start some new paintings? Yeah. See you then. Bye.